They called the place ETA because someone on the first crew loved the old sagas, and because the official designation, GF81/Transect Delta Atmospheric and Cryogeochemistry Module, felt like a dare no human should have to say twice in a day. ETA sat on a shoulder of the Greenland ice sheet, where the wind blew clean and the horizon learned to forget itself. 3 orange modules, a power shed, a half-moon berm of snow to blunt the gale, bamboo flags marching east along a transect like a string of quiet prayers. This was the whole of it. In satellite images, the station looked like a patient insect. In the mouths of those who wintered there, it turned into a pronoun. She's holding, they would say of the generator. She's sleeping, of the weather. The summer crew numbered 7. The mechanic could rebuild a carburetor with mittens on. The medic was a cook by temperament and a stoic by training. There was a logistics lead who believed lists could keep people alive. Marta, a Polish glaciologist, loved the way snow remembered storms in layers. Her tenderness belonged to stratigraphy. A graduate student weighed aerosols and apologized to the wind. 2 others came and went with the helicopter. And there was Soren Madsen, a Danish biologist who spoke softly to petri dishes as if asking permission before disturbing their work. Soren was 39, broad-shouldered, black-bearded, the kind of face that learns gentleness in rooms where loudness used to work. He had a habit of tapping a pencil twice against a notebook before he wrote, as if testing the ice of a sentence. He studied snow algae and bacterial consortia that bloom on the topmost millimeters of summer snow, darkening it, lowering the albedo so that the ice drank more sunlight than it reflected. A bloom can make the ice thirsty, he would say for journalists who needed metaphors. In private, he said less and watched more. He liked the patience of cultures that took a week to answer. Life at ETA kept a patient schedule. Wake at 7 o'clock, coffee so strong it argued. Weather call to station Nord at 7:30. Field work if wind under 15 knots and visibility at least 2 kilometers. Noon generator check. Melt snow. Dry gloves on the rack that turned mittens into small clouds. Friday was clean everything day, Sunday sharpen and fix. The sun in summer pretended it had forgotten how to set, so people manufactured twilight with blackout shades and thicker silences. Movies happened on laptops with sound too loud for the size of the room. The day's last habit was to step outside, squint at flags, and pretend the horizon could answer questions the radio could not. The afternoon Soren disappeared was ordinary in the way the Arctic specializes in, a scene so plain it refuses foreshadowing. The morning had been brightness without distinction, sky like uninked paper, wind a whisper, temperature -8. Soren had spent hours with a spectrophotometer measuring pigments that colored snow the precise sorrow of watermelon flesh. After lunch, he and Marta flagged a new shallow core site along the Q-transect, bamboo poles wagging their prayer flag tails in the small wind. At 16:20 they came home, cheeks salted by blown frost, and signed their names in the log that measures how long a place has been inhabited by sentences. At 17:05, he keyed the lab radio. Going to check a buzzing in the shed, he told Ingrid, the medic. He put on his boots, but not his parka. The power shed sat 30 meters away. He left a cup of tea cooling by the sink, a dark-tied line along the mug where he liked to stop and think. He pulled the door against the soft hiss of the world and stepped into whiteness with the ordinary negligence of a man who believed in close horizons. No one saw him again. At 18:10, with stew called and 7 bowls set, Ingrid looked through the window at the lab door and said, "Where's Soren?" His parka hung on its hook. That fact put a fracture through the evening. The mechanic said tracks, and they ran outside in fleece and hats. 2 sets of prints led from the lab. Older ones from the afternoon's work and a fresh line of scuffs moving past the shed toward the flags. You could see his turned-in right foot if you knew his stride. The prints faded 30 paces beyond the shed and dissolved into the pale grammar of sastrugi. They fanned out in a star. 3 blasts on whistles, a code older than anyone present. They walked the transect in a line abreast, every 5th pace scanning right, every 6th left. The world was uninterested. Snowmobiles widened the search with hope and noise. Hope always drives too fast. Even so, they drove careful patterns, marked corners with wands, spoke into radios to fill the distance between people with something like company. At 2000-hour station, Nord recommended containment. The words sounded bureaucratic in their mouths, but geometry and temperature rule there. If the surface refuses to witness, you hold still until morning or until the wind stops lying. The wind was already quiet. The sun, which never formed an opinion, gave flat light that made the surface unreadable. They marked the station with 3 red flares anyway, as if to say to the ice, "Here. Return him here." A helicopter came the next day, ran racetrack patterns until fuel arithmetic insisted on home. A dog team arrived on day 3, Leaky and Varg and a gray brute named Sol, who hated rotor wash and loved the work. The dogs circled, casting left, then right, then lay down, as if admitting that silence is sometimes the truest scent. On day 4, a storm flattened all expression. On day 5, people walked again and discovered how many versions of white a person can grow tired of. They found a black glove liner at flag Q14, the laundry pen initials SM inside, and a shallow circular depression 400 meters southeast of the station where the crust had once boomed hollow and now did not. The facts gestured. They refused to talk. Probability of survival. Not, wrote the pilot who had become search coordinator. He did not read the sentence aloud. They kept the flags up anyway. For a week after, they still looked up when the lab door opened. Then for 2 weeks. And then one day someone opened it, and no one looked up, and a small bankruptcy took place that people repaid with work. The official language assembled itself around their failure with a bureaucrat's tact, spatial disorientation in low contrast, unrecognized crevasse in seasonal snow, predator unlikely, no tracks, self-harm unsupported by notes or behavior, voluntary departure implausible. Implausible became a coddling word for grief that refused the shapes offered to it. Soren's bunk was emptied by someone who should not have had to touch his socks. The photograph of the children went into a padded envelope. The mug with the brown lip of tea stain migrated to a shelf above a microwave in a city far south, where people heat soup and do not decide what grief requires. Fieldwork restarted because funding has its own metabolism. In late August, MARTA led a shallow core campaign along Q-Transect for a project on nitrate and biomass seasonality. They used a Kovacs hand auger with extensions, then the light electromechanical barrel that chews 4-inch cylinders from the planet and laughs dryly when sunlight finds the spinning teeth. Core sections slid into lay-flat bags, then sleeves, then a wooden box like bread saved for winter. At Q3, 3.22 meters down, the electromechanical barrel coughed and eased. When the core came free, something off-white crescented inside the blue like a fingernail in a book. No one expects enamel. The graduate student said, teeth, in the tone of someone naming the animal in a folktale. The mechanic swore as if taxonomy could be bullied. In the lab module, they set the core on foam cradles. Under glass, the fiction collapsed. A mandible, human, for molars on the right, 2 premolars on the left, the curve of horseshoe that belongs to us and not to seals or foxes. Between roots, tiny bubbles had frozen into pearls. The refrozen lens holding the jaw held round bubbles, not flattened ones. Meltwater, not pressure metamorphism. The ice remembered the day it was made. It had not been many days ago. The station shut the door and called the world. The world took 2 days to arrive. The base commander, a pair of investigators from Denmark with careful faces, a polar scientist who knew more about bubbles than grief. They warmed the core enough to slide the jaw free without surrendering its history to puddle. They did not try to make it cleaner than it was. Teeth are honest witnesses. They neither exaggerate nor forgive. Dental records traveled faster than weather. A dentist in Aarhus had written neat notes years before. Filling on the left first molar, root canal on the right second premolar. The mandible on the lab bench matched what the notes insisted upon. Identification achieved, said a report. A legal phrase that tells a family something and nothing in the same breath. They told his wife on a video call. The medic sat off camera because ritual needs a witness with warm hands. The wife nodded with a face already practiced in the tense of long grief. The call ended. The room sat with its mechanical sounds for a while longer than seemed fair. Outside, the bamboo flags moved as if reminding people how to look in a straight line. They held a small ritual that was both competent and embarrassed. They put the jaw in a padded case and sealed it. Under the lab hood, Ingrid drew a chalk circle where it had rested and wrote the date, because humans cannot help themselves. They stood in coats around the flags and let the wind say a thing they could not. The mechanic said, "Good night, mate," which was ridiculous in that light and therefore useful. And then they went back to work because the station was a ship and ships are saved by schedules and by the stubbornness of those who keep them. Theories bred in the warmth of the station like the steam that fogged the galley windows. The vent theory said Soren had stepped onto a thin roof over a wind-carved cavity, fallen into a shallow void not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to injure, unable to climb out. Cold did the rest. Snow bridges roofed the cavity over. In summer the depression collected melt and refroze, the jaw becoming an inclusion as ordinary dust would. The bear theory put a polar bear 2 kilometers northeast tracing the hunger math that pulls white bodies across white worlds. A bite, a shake, a separation, and the jaw traveling as far as fear allowed before being dropped. The machine theory was less a theory than a refusal. Something in the human world, stand, auger, chain, made a hard edge, a wrong angle. The rest the surface erased. None satisfied. All were tidy. The ice on the bench was not. What ice learns it keeps. The man who knew bubbles gave a talk the Sunday before the helicopter came to pull them out for the year. A Fearn core is a history of seasons, he said, drawing circles on a whiteboard the wind had tried to turn into a sail. Winter snow, fine grains, small bubbles. Wind slab, coarse grains, aligned. Melt lens, clear, round bubbles. What is inside a lens is what the surface surrendered the day the lens was made. He looked at the faces in the room and stopped there because science does not own a liturgy for this. They finished the season the way people finish seasons, with lists and duct tape. The flag stayed for wind and birds that never arrived. Packing a station is like teaching a house to forget you. The mug went into a box labeled kitchen, then into a smaller box labeled Madsen, then into a bag on a seat in a plane that pointed south. In Copenhagen, months later, a museum exhibit used a photograph of a core with bright round bubbles. The caption said, "A past you can hold." No one wrote on the wall, "Careful." Soren's family buried the jaw in a cemetery slick with November. The priest read a psalm that has traveled more latitudes than any modern passport. People brought salads in plastic boxes because kindness often comes with lids. His children learned the arithmetic of absence. Birthdays that are quieter but never silent. A father in photographs whose job became to be looked at correctly. The laboratory shipped notebooks that smelled faintly of ethanol and thaw. A colleague read them quietly and found the sentence Soren had written on an evening with good light. On calm days the ice ticks like a watch near sleep. Back at Edda, the next crew came because stations do not shut themselves for courtesy. Another graduate student wrote careful labels. Another mechanic hummed to the generator as if engine block and lullaby were nouns that belonged together. They updated the safety protocol, flag shallow vents, keep a buddy within 100 meters of the modules, log every step outside after 1700 hours. A poster went on the lab door that read in large letters, "Do not trust white." Someone underlined it twice, and later, when grief softened into a story that could be told without apology, someone wrote under it with a thin pen, "Also do not trust silence." The jaw rested in a file, and then in a box, and then in ground. The case remained open enough to read. If a witness arrived in from the weather, there would be a page to sign. None did. The landscape is a veteran of secrets. Snow eats the narrative between an act and its consequence. The wind insists on rewrites. The light refuses punctuation. From the air, you can see tracks only when tracks wish to be seen. This is not malice. It is indifference, so complete you can mistake it for a philosophy. In the bar at Station Nord, the benches varnished by decades of stories. A pilot rehearsed a version that held the room for a little while. "He went to take a picture," the pilot said. "This light, you know." He lost a glove liner. He reached down. He slipped. He cracked his jaw on the auger stand some idiot left out. He stood up, dizzy, stepped 3 meters the wrong way, and the world erased him. That auger stand sat there a week. I remember that week. The mechanic from Edda placed his glass down and said nothing because some silences deserve their own weather maps. Years later, in a different winter, someone standing outside the modules at midnight in August, a color of copper laid across everything, took a photograph because the brain requires souvenirs. In the picture, the station looks like a patient insect. The flags lean toward no one. If you stare long enough, movement begins where none exists, a trick of eyes and appetite. People who have worked north of 80 degrees of latitude know this. Your gaze will invent company. It will place a figure where a figure ought to be. It will outline, for an instant, a man at the limit of the frame, shirt sleeves, no parka, smiling at a buzzing he has decided to make quiet again. The story could end here, with a jaw in ice and a family who learned to set an extra place in their hearts rather than at the table. But endings that behave are polite to readers and unfaithful to places. Edda continued. The world warmed, storms arrived in the wrong months, and algae bloomed where they had not, a green that made the ice thirsty in ways Soren had predicted and regretted. Marta sent a paper to a journal and wrote an acknowledgement for a colleague whose name stayed with the letters laid into drafts. The graduate student took a river job in Germany and learned to love brown water. The mechanic mailed the children a seal carved from bone with a note that said, "Your father taught me how to listen to humming." On an ordinary afternoon, a visitor to the station, small, serious, new, held a mug with both hands and asked Marta, "Where do people go when they step out and the ice takes them?" Marta did not preach or lie. She said, "We draw maps on fog and walk them as far as we can. The rest is weather." The child considered this like an adult in training and then said, "Do you still use the flags?" "We do," Marta said. "They don't stop storms, but they make the horizon less lonely." Sometimes at night in the dormitory, when the blackout shades leaked a thin rope of day and dreams were poor, someone would hear a ticking like a watch near sleep. It was the ice moving, or the generator negotiating, or a cup cooling evenly. It sounded the way patience sounds when it refuses to call itself by name. Out on the transect, the melt lenses thickened and thinned, their bubbles round and rounder. They will keep what they are given. A lens is only water with a memory and a certain opinion about time. Edda's modules were dragged toward the depot at the end of the season, their floors bolted, their cupboards latched. In the wake of the tractors, the surface stitched itself closed, as if embarrassed to admit anyone had ever lived there. The flags came down, then went up again for the next crew, which is as close to resurrection as science allows. The tea mug found its shelf in a kitchen that did not know what it was storing. The notebook with the sketch of bubbles labeled music waited in a drawer for a day that might not arrive, which is to say, it waited perfectly. What remains is a set of coordinates and a set of hands, a label on a box, and a memory of someone who believed the world could be studied into kindness. The Arctic does not hate or forgive. It invites you to measure, and then it declines to be solved. The rest is ours. The way we invent ceremony beside machines. The way we choose sentences that make absence survivable. The way, even now, a pair of eyes in the corner of a photograph might look like a man at the edge of a frame, standing in his shirt sleeves at 5 past 5, listening, patient, to a hum only he can hear. After they left, winter put its palm over the station and held it. At 40 below, metal remembers other shapes. The wind braided sastrugi into scripture no one could read. In March, the maintenance convoy came in a line like punctuation, towing fuel bladders and crates and gossip. A mechanic new to the ice asked, over instant coffee, about the chalk circle under the hood. Ingrid had rotated out, but the story lived in a dozen small objects. The way people stood a beat longer at the lab door before Steppy. Soren's life reached backward from the station through photographs and receipts. The way any life will if you lay it out on a table and fetch tea. Born in Ovensay, he had learned tide pools before he learned times tables. The first thing he bought with his own money was a hand lens. University brought bacteria that made pigments at 5 degrees Celsius, and he was hooked on small creatures that could edit light. In his 20s, he went to Svalbard and learned to walk without turning pride into brittleness. He married at tea. Even in a narrative without malice, people search for agency because agency is a handhold. Ingrid wrote a letter to herself she never sent. If I had insisted on the buddy check at 1700 hours, would he have waited? If I had been less casual with a quiet day, would I have looked up sooner? If I had made the stew worse, would the smell have pulled him back? She kept the letter in a cookbook because recipes are a way to make the universe obey for an evening. Station Nord's report had appendices the public never read. Maps with squares like chess turned sideways. Notes about how air temperature can turn a search dog's nose into an honest liar. A paragraph explaining how the flattening of bubbles in a refrozen layer can age a lens by a season if you're careless. There was a photograph of the core in cross-section with arrows and neat letters. Someone had circled a tiny crescent in the enamel and written composite. A dental pathologist later replied, "No composite." In Aarhus, the dentist who had filed the records cried in his car after reading the request because the body keeps accounts you do not choose. He remembered the man in the chair making a joke about how even molars make music if you listen with a microphone. He told no one, dentistry is a quiet trade. The jaw, once released to the family, became an object surrounded by a weather of decisions. Ashes or earth, church or sea, speak or keep. The chosen ritual turned out to be modest, a patch of ground, a circle of voices that refused to pretend justice had happened. The priest did a thing not in his book. He asked anyone present to say a true sentence. The mechanic from Edda said, he had a way of making tea taste like plans. Marta said nothing. Silence, when shaped carefully, is truthful. The medic sent. Back at Edda, the next summer, a graduate student named Petra taped a card above the lab sink. It read, if you leave, tell someone. If you arrive, tell someone. If you find yourself between two flags and cannot say which is nearer, put your face to the wind and wait. Below that, in smaller letters, someone had added, and make tea. The card became part of the station's architecture the way a coat hook becomes a belief. On calm days, the ice made a sound like a pocket watch caught in a sweater. Petra learned to listen for it, as if it could be advice. She learned to love the pale green of a bloom spread too thin to be seen by anyone in a satellite. She learned that grief in a lab looks like clean benches and sharpened pencils. Once, late, she opened the freezer to fetch ethanol and stood in the cold long enough to remember the man she had never met. Memory is not a protocol. It arrives and leaves according to its own barome. There were investigations online too, a brief storm of armchair plots that tried to turn the word jaw into a franchise. A blogger wrote about sabotage, another about military projects hidden under ice, a third about a cult of glaciologists who fed their heretics to crevasses. People at the station read none of it. The world south of 70 degrees needed different entertainments. Up here, you counted flags and ate stew and called North Wind by its name. A year after the mandible came out of the core, Marta and a colleague published a short note in a journal not many people read. It detailed the stratigraphy of the refrozen lens and the bubble geometry, argued for same season emplacement, and, in a footnote, recommended that stations treat shallow vents as variable hazards. The editor rejected the footnote as advice rather than result. Marta sighed and moved the sentence into the cover letter to the safety committee instead, where sentences sometimes be calm. In the logistics module, an old radio sat in a corner, tuned always to a frequency that mostly held nothing. Once, when the sun was a coin and the flags did their patient semaphore, the radio coughed a sound like a click and a breath. Ingrid, back for a rotation, wrote in the station log. Heard something I wanted to be a voice. She did not say whose. The child who had asked Marta about where people go wrote a school report called Things Ice Remembers. It had crayon diagrams of bubbles and a drawing of an orange module with a tiny blue door. Underneath, in the serious script of someone inventing their future, the child wrote, "We must be kind because time is not." The teacher underlined it and wrote, "Explain," which is one of the ways adulthood begins. The sea took an interest too, as it always does. In late August, fog walked in off the Wandle like a person allowed to be late. The world turned into a room without walls. A bear materialized at the edge of sight and then dissolved, a rumor made of muscle. For 2 hours the station existed as sound, generator talk, kettle hiss, people refusing to say the same sentence at the same time. When the fog tore itself into scarves and left, the flags returned one by one, like friends arriving for a thing that was Someone asked, much later, why the jaw mattered so much when so little else could be said for certain. The answer was banal and therefore correct. Bodies anchor stories. Without a bone, you can walk in circles forever and call the walking meaning. With a bone, you can at least say, here is a place to stand. The jaw gave a hinge to grief's mouth. It let speech open and close without breaking. 2 winters on, the station modules were dragged again. The new crew found the chalk circle under the hood faint but still there, as if carbonates prefer stubbornness. They left it. There is superstition even in rooms built for precision. When a glass beaker shattered cleanly into the shape of a crescent with small teeth, the mechanic swept it up and said, "Not funny," to no one in particular. In Copenhagen, a curator who had borrowed a photograph of the core for an exhibit sent the station a note with a copy of the visitor comments. Most were the usual, wows and emojis, and a complaint about lighting. One said, "I did not know that ice could hold a person the way a book holds a sentence." Another said, "I will call my father." The curator added a postscript. "Do you want the mug back?" They did not. Objects meant for use carry weight when retired. The mug had become a relic, and relics do poor W. The day the helicopter took Marta out for the last time, she walked along the flags with the mechanic. The world was bright and untroubled in that lying way. If someone asked what we learned, he said, what would we say? She took time because time was the only currency that mattered. That maps are temporary. That safety is a conversation. That ice is a librarian with rules we don't yet read well. He nodded, then grinned. That tea can be improved with cardamom. She smiled, a small, survival kind SM.